what is democracy doing well?
So, I guess this is sort of one of the contexts here is compared to what? Democracy in general is, I think, without a doubt, the best system of governance that we've ever put into this sort of practice, especially at this sort of scale. If you look at world economies, then the top economies are the vast majority of democracies. That's true for like education, culture, all that sort of stuff. So democracy is obviously doing good things that aren't possible with, I guess, some of the less democratic ideas out there. It does a lot of good stuff. It does make progress, albeit slow. It does provide us with like changes of leadership when we need to. It does provide a way for people to actually put a voice out there and change something that they perceive to be a problem. Not always, sometimes they're wrong about whether it's a problem or not, but it gives them avenues. So democracy does a lot of good things.
What sort of progress, when you say it, stimulates progress, what sort of progress are you talking about?
Well, I think I said it makes progress. Stimulates progress is, maybe not the right term. Democracy, because democracy ultimately relies on the electors, it means that if the administration is ignoring the problems that electors are facing, if the administration is ignoring future problems or potential things that are going to come up or whatever else, unlike other systems of governance, this has a more immediate effect, not particularly immediate, especially if there's a 4-year lag, but has a more immediate effect. And so there's a strong incentive within democratic frameworks, at least every 3 or 4 years, to actually solve some problems. So it does, like the incentives are right to make progress in a non-zero way, like at least a little bit of progress. And when I say progress, by the way, I'm talking particularly about like solving the problems that either that are perceived as problems or not, like there are problems out there that people don't realize are problems, but it's essentially, using the knowledge that humanity has created, possibly recently, possibly not, but using our knowledge to solve our problems, make our lives better standards of living, things like that. That's what I think it really is about, right? Is democracy it's there because we live in one space, we all have to live together. Doing that means that we are going to have friction, and we need ways of resolving that friction, of resolving that tension, and solving problems. So I think democracy, the ultimate purpose of democracy is solving problems.
A word that we're going to be using a lot, I think, is the word democracy. Could you maybe clarify what we mean by democracy?
Yeah, so I think just going back to the root of the word is the easiest way to do it, which is rule by the people. As opposed to, rule by a group or rule by a single person or rule by a bloodline or whatever else. So I think a democratic system is any system wherein any single person has the opportunity through non-violent means to change, policies, legislation, decisions, stuff like that. It's one of those things where, like, I think a lot of systems that we wouldn't perceive as democratic are sort of like technically democratic. I think that one of the main things is just that there's not any authority that's in that system is something that has to come from something like an election. There are, of course, ways to pervert that by, preventing people from even having being nominated. That's an easy way to control a democracy, but on the whole, it's any system wherein like a member of that system can change, the course of it. It can either change the rules or change legislation.
And so there's one word, democracy, to define what seems to me like a very broad concept of one person being able to have an influence in governance or in the decisions that are made. Is there a scale there where you can sort of measure, from this type of democracy to this type of democracy? Like, where do you define the variations in democracy?
So I think this is another one of those things where you need like an explanatory framework before you even get to that question.
Yeah.
And I'd say the evidence for this is just ask multiple people what is true democracy. Lots of people use that term, but they also disagree a lot.
Yeah.
And so if we knew what true democracy was, it sort of reminds me of the whole real Scotsman example. But if we knew what true democracy was, then a lot of that would be quite easy.
Is true democracy, To me, true democracy sounds like the perfect democracy. You know, it's true. Like it's.
I think it's like pretty much everything that humans do. Democracy is fallible. There is no system that is ever going to be able to do anything perfectly in that regard. I mean, arguably, what is even a true democracy, a perfect democracy? Like, does it make good decisions even when people are wrong about the world? Like, does it accurately channel their will and things like that? It's one of these things where you get into really murky territory. So I don't like to think of it like that. In terms of something close to measuring, I think it's really hard to actually come up with a measurement. But in terms of estimating that sort of thing or understanding it, I think the way to it depends on how you frame what democracy should do. So earlier I mentioned the idea that for me democracy is about solving problems. It's not about satiating people's personal desires to be on a soapbox. It's not about pushing, or rather, if it is about pushing agendas, then I think that you end up with bad results. And because it depends on what you think it should do as to how you'd measure that, it's a sort of a hard question to answer. For me, a system of democracy is better than another system if it solves problems more reliably, quicker, things like that. So, and I think that's very hard to do in exclusionary manners. It's hard to have a rich, up-to-date society type thing, and to be better at solving problems by excluding people. Maybe I'm sure we can all think of half a dozen people that it might be made better by excluding, but you can't apply that en masse across a society. Yeah. The reality is that, like, if you want a democratic system, then it has to be something where everyone gets involved in, or everyone has the potential to get involved in, and then the efficacy of that is like how well does it perform in making our lives better.
So, what's another thing that the current democracy is doing well? Like, how else? If you had to complement the Australian, systems.
So one of the, I guess, if we look at democracy versus non-democratic systems, to look for some examples there, we tend to have a lot more accountability in terms of, like, if our leaders in Australia do something that is strongly disapproved of, then there can be, firstly, they're very public, so that means that we know a lot about them, but we can also have very rapid responses. In extreme cases, those rapid responses are, changes of leadership, like we've experienced over the last decade here in Australia. But I think that's good, because it means that we're not too bogged down by any individual ideology. Just like ideologies, like any idea, have problems and can be improved and things like that. So none of them are perfect. We need multiple ideologies. So actually, that's a really good thing that it does, is that it allows a lot of, like, a high diversity of thought within society. It allows, like, a lot of different people to have lots of different ideas and to still coexist peacefully. Whereas you can, pick some of the other countries around that aren't democracies, and that isn't something we observe. Particularly if you look at a lot of the, poorer nations, then you have, like, they're very homogenous, which, if you look at their census results, you see stuff like, 99% of people being one religion, in some examples. I think there's some countries in Africa like that. You see a lot of, particularly around a lot of the stuff that Western societies have dealt with over the last 50 years, you still see in some non-democratic countries, like, that is still a problem, even though those countries might be reasonably wealthy. And so, allowing that diversity of thought is really important. I think democracy is really good at creating environments, like, centered around good values as well, partially because democracy comes out of good values, but a lot of what I mean by that is stuff like, freedom of enterprise, for example. Just the degree of, like, business ideas and projects that people start and not-for-profits and all that sort of thing is much higher in a democratic society than not. And so that's really important. And I think that fundamentally is a lot of the, like, fabric of society in terms of how well we can, get along with people or tolerate people with differences to us and stuff like that. I think is, it's a measurement of society in terms of, would you like to live there?
What is it about having that diverse thought, the diverse opinions to draw from, that kind of creates a more productive society.
Well, you definitely
can replace that word if you want. But
you definitely need like diversity for productivity.
Yeah.
If for no other reason, stuff like division of labor. Particularly in modern societies, like division of knowledge. So specialization in general is really big. That obviously flows back into stuff like specialization and trade and whatever else. So there's a lot of synergies around that. I think like broadly speaking, without having a really diverse society, you end up like running into a wall eventually. You might go for a while, but you will run into a wall that will be fatal to that culture. And I think that's an inevitability. Cultures can exist for a long while, but they can't exist for a long while and make progress without having good values, and ultimately good values don't lead to authoritarianism. So
no, I totally agree.
Yeah,
I totally agree. And and I guess where do you see the shortcomings in?
That's a much easier question to answer. So I think this is one of those things where it almost doesn't matter who you talk to. Anyone in Western society will talk about problems in democracy.
Yeah.
Everyone's got an opinion. There's a lot of obvious stuff like, we like in at least a lot of the systems we have today, it can be highly divisive. That's not good at polarizing people does not typically increase, the quality of our thought or the quality of our policy or things like that. There are some counterexamples there actually, but not in general. So democracy it's good at excluding people. So it's good at, particularly minorities will find it very hard to ever get representation. A lot of the systems that we do have that give minorities better representation end up with worse policy because they have like too much diversity in the policy development department. This is sort of, I guess, an interesting point as well, is that like democracy is just because everyone should have the opportunity to be able to change laws or influence laws and rules doesn't mean that adding everyone together is a good idea. In fact, that's a really bad idea. If you just created like a mishmash policy that satisfied everyone, it would probably do a lot of chaotic, weird stuff and would ultimately not be good, even though everyone was happy. So it's bad at creating, or some democracies are bad at creating really consistent policy platforms. Democracy typically has a slow cycle, like I mentioned earlier, the 3-4 years. That really limits policy innovation, it limits experimentation. It also means that, if we can only try, try 3 different, governments sort of thing, or political parties over the course of, say, 10 years, that really limits our ability to evolve as a culture. So I think that's definitely a problem. There's also 2 ways to think about problems with democracy. One of them is the systemic issues, like the more theoretical ones, and the other one is like, what do people perceive as problems? Like in terms of perceptions of problems, you'll talk about, people will complain about the left or the right doing different things. They'll complain about, individual policies. They'll complain about, even though someone's been publicly criticized, they don't respond to it, or things like, there's a lot of that sort of stuff. But for me, I think the more interesting things are all of the systemic issues, the stuff that is, like, if we don't solve those problems, they're not, like, we're never going to be able to have an effective democracy.
So what's an example of one of these systemic issues?
So I think the biggest one, the biggest problem that we have in democracy today is that when, we have majoritarian systems. And majoritarian systems are, I think, necessary because, the alternative is like a minority-based system, and that, doesn't seem to, gel well with the idea of making progress. But the problem with the way that we implement the idea of majority is that when in representative democracy, that majority sticks around for 3 years or so, in Australia 3 years, and it doesn't change. And the problem with that is that while we've got some ability to change in terms of, the leaders of parties can change, so cabinet can change, ministers can change, but the party itself doesn't change. And it really limits the sort of feedback effects that we can provide or use in a democracy. So I think that's part of the really big problem. The other thing about this majoritarianism, or this majoritarianism that doesn't change, so I call that static majoritarianism. The other thing about that is that it lets people, even if we're talking about a proportional representation system where there's lots of different parties and groups who are, in either the parliament or the government, things like that, it lets them leverage issues against one another. like the way that we do democracy now means that like if you're in the balance of power, as is often the case in Britain because of their three-party system, in our Senate that's very common because we have a system that is friendlier to minority parties. When you've got something like that, the people in the balance of power become essentially the gatekeepers to passing policy. Because if they side with the opposition, they can block it. If they don't, they can let it pass. And that means that they're able to manipulate the ruling party to help get their agenda through. And likewise, the ruling party can then, like, maybe not manipulate them, but they can definitely leverage them to, for outside political gains that really don't matter to that, the third party or the balance of power. Because the balance of power, like anyone in politics, they care about their agenda. They care about what they're there to do for.
Do you think these issues are as blatantly clear to people that are actually perpetrating the issue?
I think if you gave them some hints, they would start to, they would very easily start to go down that line of thinking. I don't think that's what they perceive now, partially because, in terms of the sort of confrontation and conflict that goes on in Parliament and democratic systems, their enemy is not the system; it's the people who are voting against them.
Yeah.
The idea of a party whip being a really crucial member to a political party to get everyone, keep them in line. The fact that we have that and that we use a violent metaphor for it, I think people they do start to realize, if you give them the right hints, they will start to realize what more of these problems are. Because if you think about why is a party whip necessary? Well, it's like, okay, so you have an extra 5 members, say, in government, so you got a little bit of tolerance. But if you then had 6 party members, maybe out of 50 or things like that, so 10% of the party vote differently or disagree with you across the floor, then you've now lost the ability to make decisions. And so you need to stay really together. And all of that, all the psychology around that it's all about the intergroup dynamics or inter and intra-group dynamics in Parliament, and it's not about the parliamentary system. So while if maybe if you got a few beers into a federal MP, you could have a pretty productive discussion and get them more on your side. I don't think that's what they think about. I don't think that's what they perceive the problems as. I mean, if you listen to them campaigning, obviously the phrase "drain the swamp" became quite popular a few years ago. And
could you explain that?
Oh, so this was, I think, just part of Trump's campaign where he was arguing that politics was really corrupt. Again, a really common thing, but not that anyone knows what to do about it. Politics is really corrupt. We're going to drain the swamp, get all of the people who have made careers out of this, kick them out, and we'll bring in new people who really want to do a good job. That ended the same way it always does, which is that politicians employ their friends and supporters, because that's what you have to do in a democracy. You have to go through. You have to go to that level to make sure that you actually maintain an ability to implement policy. So I guess that's maybe another way to look at this core issue is that the incentive structures that we have set up are such that you need to negotiate and manipulate people around you to maintain the ability to actually be effective at all. And so, personally, I would like the ability to be effective without needing to, convince people who are determined to disagree with me, or to manipulate people either via leveraging some of their interests or whatever. I'd like a system without that. I'd like a system that lets people. Merit is a word here, but I'm cautious about the term meritocracy, so I don't mean that. But essentially, that on the basis of the merit of the ideas, that a good idea should have the easiest path forward, or it should be easier than all the others. Essentially, all the other possible ideas in that area. That's what I'd like to see, and I think that's if we had a system. An incentive system that allowed for that, as opposed to this manipulation and coercion and party whips and stuff like that, then I think we'd end up with a not only a more productive system but a more accepting system.